We're privileged tonight to have a highly skilled MC who will facilitate a discussion to help us all make an informed decision when we vote in the referendum. Professor Melissa Castan, Director of Castan Centre for Human Rights Law and Associate Dean Staffing at the Law Faculty, Monash University. The Castan Centre is a renowned academic centre contributing to a world where human rights are respected and protected, allowing people to pursue their lives in freedom and with dignity. Melissa has over 25 years' experience teaching, researching and publishing in Australian public law, constitutional law, human rights law, Indigenous legal issues and legal education. Wow. Please welcome Melissa.
Thank you so much, and thank you, Gillian, for your warm welcome. And if I can just start by reminding everyone to turn off their phones just now so we don't have any unwanted interruptions. So, welcome everybody. I'm so pleased we can come together tonight to address this important issue of the upcoming referendum, to be held, as we all know, on the 14th of October. And thank you for joining this conversation about the voice presented by the Southern Women's Action Network, who do very powerful and wide-ranging work in this area. So I just want to start before I forget what I'm going to say, and thank all the organisers for putting on this event and for doing all the preparations and logistics, because there's a lot that goes into these that we don't see, and we just turn up and get the benefit of it. So thank you very much for all the fabulous people in the SWAN network. I'm joined today by a terrific panel of experts, and in a moment I will introduce them to you, but I wanted to take a moment to also start by acknowledging the Bunurong people as the traditional owners and custodians of the land where we're meeting here today. And I invite you to consider the country that you are from and where you are meeting on, and acknowledge the people who are deeply connected to that country and those places. And I want to pay respect to the elders past and present, and also acknowledge and welcome all the First Nations people who are joining us tonight. And I'm so glad you could be here with us tonight for this occasion. I want to make a few observations about, in my role as an educator, as you've said, Eric, you made me feel a little old, but as an educator and as a scholar and an academic in law, I feel that I have an important role to play in addressing the situation that we are in right now, the dispossession that is caused and the continuing impact of what I'm describing as Captain Cook's law, which is Anglo-Australian law, as it applies now across Australia. And I know that many of my colleagues at Monash University feel the same way about this obligation to help inform people and have conversations and communicate about the impact of what Australian law does to various different people in Australia. And that's particularly relevant now. It's over 30 years since the High Court handed down the Mabo case, and it's over 25 years since the Bringing Them Home report by Sir Ronald Wilson and Professor Meg Dodson was published. And these were just two of many, many steps in the national journey from this imposition of Australian law to what I hope is the restoration of proper legal relations between First Nations and the settler state of Australia. And now we are faced with the next step in that journey, this referendum that we all confront now, and the implementation of a voice to Parliament, an advisory body at the federal level. And Noel Pearson described this the other week as a proposal that is simple but profound, and I think that is a very apt description. So we aim to have a keynote, and then a panel will discuss some questions, and then we will take the time to, if we can get the microphones working, I'm hoping we'll be able to take questions from the audience as well. But I'm aware that we do have a closing time. I think it's about 9:15, so at some point I will have to take the chair's obligation and draw things to a close, but that's for later. I want to turn now to address our panel, to introduce our panel, and tell you a little bit about them. So first I want to introduce to you Kate Carnell, AO, who is a former Liberal Party Chief Minister of the ACT, a pharmacist by profession, And Kate is also an experienced company director and small business advisor. And she's had roles in the Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry and served as the inaugural Australian Small Business and Family Enterprise Ombudsman until 2021, itself an advisory body of one nature. Don't forget about that. Kate was appointed an officer to the Order of Australia in 2006 for her services to the community through her contributions to economic development and support for the business sector, knowledge industries, the medical sector and medical technology advances, and she currently serves on a number of boards. So if you'll join me in welcoming Kate. Next, I'd like to introduce Peter Aldenhoven, who is known to some of you already, but not everybody. Peter is a descendant of the peoples of the Quandamooka, more particularly from the people of Mornington Island, Queensland. Peter, I'm not going to try and say that wrong. You might have a chance to say it right for me, I'm sorry. But Peter is the Chief Executive Officer of William Warrane, an Aboriginal gathering place based in Hastings nearby. And Peter has extensive background in Indigenous philanthropy, has spoken at national and international conferences about how to invest effectively in First Nations communities. He's an Indigenous educator. He runs exchange programs with different remote communities in the Northern Territory, and I know that he's been involved in cultural training and related activities in this area as well. So please welcome Peter. And Bryce Patterson is a lawyer who grew up just down the road in Rye, where he still lives today. I feel that everyone should know where you live, Bryce. A graduate of the University of Melbourne, Bryce has practiced law here in Australia, in Asia and in the Middle East, so he has a great international and domestic perspective. And Bryce specialises in public and private law and has a passion for constitutional law and electoral policy. So Bryce and I have a lot in common, because we could probably talk about constitutional law for way too long, but we'll restrain ourselves tonight and we'll try and focus on the questions that people are actually interested in, not just the things that Bryce and I are interested in. So I'd like you to join me in welcoming Kate to the stage to give her keynote presentation tonight.
Thank you all very much for having me. It's an absolute pleasure to have been invited to come down to talk to you today. As you've heard, I'm a Liberal for yes. There's a few of us. There we are. And I'll tell you why, from my perspective. I've been a member of the Liberal Party for a very long time, with lifetime Distinguished Service Awards, all that stuff. I was the Liberal Chief Minister of the ACT for 2 terms, and before that Leader of the Opposition, and a range of other things. You've heard my background is in business, small business. I also, though, did spend a bit of time in Victoria as CEO of Beyond Blue, and I'm still on the board of Beyond Blue. But so why have I decided to go down the path of being, I suppose, aggressively out there, talking about yes as a Liberal, and saying to other people who perceive themselves to possibly be Conservative voters, or maybe on that side of the political agenda, shall we say, why you too should vote yes. Now, you know, yes, this referendum, to start with, it is very, very simple. I know you would have heard a lot of things that sounded like it was really complex and all the rest of it. I'm not confident looking at around. Yeah, there's a few people who probably are in the TikTok generation, but gee whiz, there's some rubbish on TikTok. You can't believe it. But just for a moment, okay, so what does it do? This little tiny card has what you will be asked to vote on. And fundamentally, it says, in recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as First Peoples of Australia, statement of fact. Can't argue with that. They were here before us for probably 65,000 years. There will be a body to be called the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Voice. The Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Voice may make representations to Parliament and the Executive Government of the Commonwealth on matters relating to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, not on submarines, not on foreign policy, on matters relating to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Now, the final bit, clause 3, is the Parliament shall, subject to this Constitution, have power to make laws with respect to matters relating to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, including the composition, functions, powers and procedures of the voice. Sorry, I should have said of the voice. That's all it is. And you just get to vote yes or no, right? Yes or no. So fundamentally it recognises Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people as Australia's first people, that is just a statement of fact, through a voice to Parliament. And the voice is a consultative group. It is a committee that will give advice, will make representation to government and to the executive. And when we talk about executive, we're talking about ministers in the public service fundamentally, and advisory bodies like the one I used to run, the Small Business and Family Enterprise Ombudsman role. That's a piece of legislation that was set up to give small business a voice to Parliament. Funny about that. Nothing really bad happened, or has happened as a result of this, but for all of that, there are lots of these sorts of groups around Parliament. I'd have to say probably too many, but apart from that, so the bit about the executive, in my view, is just a whole lot of rubbish, really. And in all of my roles, and roles I do now, I make representation to public servants and ministers on a whole range of different issues. I was the CEO of the Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry. The whole role of that job is to make representation to, not just to Parliament, in fact mostly to the executive, to ministers and the public service. So it's nothing to be worried about. So fundamentally, there's recognition, talked about that, Australia's first people. There's a guarantee that there will be a body to be called the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Voice. There's a purpose, and that's that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander, the voice may make representation to the Parliament and the executive government of the Commonwealth on matters relating to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and the detail will be worked out by our elected representatives, Parliament. So what will happen after, hopefully, we vote yes, the government will put together a group which I believe will be bipartisan, will bring together all sides of Parliament along with Indigenous leaders and others in the community to put together how the voice will work, how many people will be on it, how it may be elected, appointed, what the breadth of the powers will be. Now the good bit about that is it means, because it's legislation in Parliament, it can be changed if it needs to be tweaked. The thing that can't be changed is that there will be a voice. Now, back to why I'm advocating for yes. One thing I learned as a politician is that good policy comes when you don't think you know more than everyone else, when you actually talk to the people who are going to be affected by policy that you're putting together early on in the process. And then you include them in the process of implementing policy. That's just, it's sort of a no-brainer, isn't it? So you talk to people about stuff that's going to affect them, and then you include them in how you're going to make it work. I think that's just fundamental good government, good policy. Unfortunately, in Indigenous policy over lots of years, we thought we knew better. We've abolished groups, ANZSEC, whole range, I think it'd be 13 different Indigenous groups, probably want to be more, that one government set up, another one's got rid of. Fundamentally, there's been no consistency in the space. This will give consistency that means there will be a voice, that will be remembered. a consultative group that can give representations to Parliament, may give representation to Parliament. Hopefully, executive government, meaning ministers and the public service, asks the voice on all issues that will affect Indigenous and Torres Strait Islander people. In fact, I know they will, because we, as voters, will think they should if this thing exists and if it gets up. So this really matters. But you know the other reason? So, you know, as a Liberal, I believe in good policy. That's how you make good policy. As a Liberal, I also believe in not throwing good money after bad. In other words, we spend a lot of money on Indigenous policy, on Indigenous services, a whole range of things. And we really haven't tweaked the dial very well at all. And that's over different governments, you know, Liberal, Coalition, Labor, whatever. The fact is we are spending a lot of money and not getting a whole lot of good outcomes here. As a Liberal, I believe you don't keep doing something that hasn't worked very well. You know, you look to do something different. And it's a pretty good idea to do something different that is what the people who are going to be affected by this want. And it's really important to remember that the idea here of a voice came from Indigenous people, not just as over a weekend at Uluru, but over huge amounts of consultation over long periods of time. Then 250 Indigenous leaders at Uluru signed the Statement of the Heart. They asked us, as Australians, to give them a voice. I think, from my perspective, we have almost an obligation to do things that are different here, to close the gap, to give Indigenous people a real opportunity to make a difference. And I love what Noel Pearson said in an event the other day. He said, you know, the thing that's different here is that we, as Indigenous people, are taking responsibility for this. We can't continue to blame government for bad stuff that happens to Indigenous people. We have to take responsibility. And what we are saying through the Uluru Statement of the Heart, through the voice, is we are going to make this thing work. If Australia votes yes, we are going to make it work. Not Canberra, but Indigenous leaders in this country. And that's what we need, a change of responsibility. Again, a good solid Liberal philosophy here, you know, good solid personal responsibility, all that sort of stuff. So you can see, from my perspective, this is about spending money wisely. It's about personal responsibility. It's about giving people a capacity to be the best they can be through a voice, and having policy where you actually talk to the people who are going to be affected early on in the space. Sounds like pretty standard Liberal Party philosophy to me. So for those of you who might be saying, oh, you know, I keep hearing, you know, Dutton and others say, vote no because it's too scary. I'll let the lawyers talk about scariness in a minute. It's simply not scary. I read the whole thing to you. There's not another 26 pages, I promise. There's just that little bit. That's what we're being asked to vote on. Can we just cut the noise a bit? Look at what we're actually being asked to vote on. And again, coming back to it, we haven't done very well for Indigenous people in this country. No, that's not an argument, it's just a reality. They are telling us they want this voice, and they are telling us that they'll make it work. We've got to give them an opportunity to do so, haven't we? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kate. Oh, I feel quite moved. I have to join the Liberal Party now. My brother's laughing at me, he's in the audience. Thank you, Kate, for starting us off. I want to now take a slightly different tack and ask Peter a question. I'll ask some questions to the panel, and then we'll come to the audience questions. But Peter, I wonder if you could tell us, from your perspective, how you think that the voice to Parliament might help in addressing historical injustices faced by Aboriginal Australians now. Kate's talked a little bit about the future-facing part of it, but could you reflect a bit on what it means in the context, not just in the future, but looking overall?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Well, I'm listening to Kate about good policy and listening to people, and obviously it's just such a no-brainer. It hurts me even to articulate the argument, but if you talk to the people you're developing policy for, then obviously you'll get better policy and you'll get better outcomes. In the Uluru Statement from the Heart, there's a phrase about the utter powerlessness that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people feel as a result of colonisation and as a result of waves of government policies controlling every aspect of our lives. I could do a history lesson here. Unfortunately, sitting behind a simple, modest proposal is a lot of educative work. A big story of truth-telling around colonisation and its impacts on our mobs all over the country. We need a voice, an advisory body that can make representations to the government of the day and to executive government, to Parliament and the executive government, because you look back at all the policies that have caused such enduring damage to our peoples. Dispossession, being placed on reserves and missions, the assimilation period where our babies and children were removed, the Northern Territory intervention. There's been so many examples where every aspect of our lives have been controlled by government policy, and the enduring harms that have been visited upon our peoples need to be stopped into the future. So if we get voice, Prime Minister Anthony Albanese said that it will have a moral power, and I think you've alluded to that too, Kate, that it will have some heft to it. It will be hard for a government of the day and for bureaucrats to ignore advice from mob about very relevant Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander areas. It won't be about, as you were saying, dot paintings on submarines. We're not interested in that. But policy about justice, about education, about health, about housing, about employment, all the things that we need a say on to improve the lives of our peoples. So that's the opportunity that presents itself with voice, for us to be able to speak, and for the first time for government to listen to us and hear what we have to say.
Thank you, Peter. I'm going to turn to Bryce now and ask you a bit of a technical question, because I know he loves a bit of a challenge. Bryce, Kate spoke a little bit about the words of the referendum amendment and just what the words actually say. Now, I know you've memorised it by heart, so I'm not going to ask you, because I love a bit of an assessment challenge, but I'm not going to do that now. But I do want to ask you, and this is a question that comes up a lot, people are saying, well, I understand what's in those words, but what is the actual voice? What is the thing that we're talking about? There's a lot of confusion about, or purported confusion about what the voice actually represents. Can you tell us a little bit about the detail of what it might be?
Yeah, no problem. Kate read it out to everyone. That's 95 words out of a constitution of 12,000. And I think it's worthwhile to unpack just a couple of those 95 words. The first is representation. The voice will not make laws. The voice will not dictate. Parliament and the executive is only obliged to listen, not to act. The second is matters relating to. You can only make representations on matters relating to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. This narrows the jurisdiction of the voice. We're quite fortunate to have a constitution in those other 12,000 words that uses these phrases a number of times. In fact, it's probably one of the most repeated set of phrases in our constitution. Because it's so embedded in our constitution, we actually have 120 years of High Court decisions interpreting those phrases. So that can give a lot of confidence to the audience that we're not going to see the voice opining on interest rate policies, zoning laws, where to fish, where not to fish. We have historical jurisprudence from the High Court of Australia looking at those same words we are voting on. I think the final point to touch on is the sort of the tail end of the 95 words that we're asked to vote on, and that's that the Parliament will make laws with respect to the voice.
Thank you. And I guess you've actually touched on something that is very important, and it's the Constitution is a framework document, and it never really delves into much detail about what's going to happen. So it'll say there shall be elections, or there shall be quarantine, or there shall be external affairs, accounting, lighthouses, but the Constitution doesn't set out what a lighthouse actually looks like, or what an election actually looks like, or any of those things. It leaves all of that to Parliament, and often in the Constitution it says, until Parliament otherwise provides, there shall be a such and such. And so it's really considered constitutionally inappropriate to put a lot of detailed information into that framework document. The detail comes later from each Parliament from time to time as they change it.
That's right, and that's the way we want it, right? Our society changes over time. The needs and wants and desires of Indigenous people will change over time. We don't want to be hardwiring in exactly what the voice looks like today. We want it to be responsive to our society as it changes and evolves over time.
So Kate, can I ask you, this question of a referendum, why do we have to have a referendum? Why are we going to all of this energy and politicking and expense to have a referendum process? And what do we have to achieve in order to win a referendum? What does a referendum require?
Well, I suppose first of all, we're recognising Indigenous and Torres Strait Islanders as Australia's first people, but then that's been, I think, it has been suggested or recommended by various Prime Ministers, right from John Howard back in 2007, who said he would do it in his next term until he lost. So the reality is this isn't a very controversial thing to recognise Indigenous people. But just recognising in a preamble or whatever, without any mechanism to actually recognise, I suppose, if it's just words and it doesn't do anything, I don't know that that's a very reasonable approach. So we recognise through a voice to Parliament. That's what we're being asked to do, and the voice will be a consultative group, and Parliament will determine how this thing works. So why do we need a referendum? Because what we can't see is what's happened in the past. Remember, I talked about, bad policy, various governments doing things, some that worked, some that didn't. Next government changed them. Some entity was set up and then it was abolished. So I think why we need a referendum is we do need to change the Constitution, and we do need to recognise Australia's first people, and we do have to have a mechanism to allow that to happen. And then Parliament does the detail, people we recommend. It means that you can change the way it works, but you can't change the fact it exists. So there will be a voice if we vote yes, but over time what that voice looks like can change because it's legislation of that Parliament.
And a referendum has a special requirement regarding how many people vote.
Oh yes, it's really hard to change constitutions. So you need a majority of voters across Australia, and then you need a majority of states as well. I live in the ACT, we don't count, nor does the Northern Territory. Well, we count in terms of the total numbers of votes. We don't count as a state, but that's, we accept that. So you've got to have a double majority, as it's called, and that's the reason we don't get referendums up very often in Australia. I think we've had 8 up since Federation, and we've had lots and lots of failures.
So I will just add, because I do love to lecture about constitutional law, that most of the failed referendums have been when Parliament wanted to extend its own power and said, we want more power over corporations, or we want more power over this and that, and the population has said, well, Parliament, we're not so sure, we want to give you more power over that, we'll leave it with the states, or we'll leave it where it is. Most of those failures have resulted, and that's not what's happening in this referendum, because this isn't more power for Parliament. It's only saying there will be an advisory body. So it might fall into that category of the kind that can get up.
Hope so.
Peter, can I turn to you now and just talk a little bit about Indigenous representation? Because it's, we understand that Australia has diverse Indigenous communities and populations. To what extent, in your view, can the Voice to Parliament ensure representation and inclusivity for all Indigenous communities and even dissenting groups who don't agree with each other? How will the Voice actually be set up to support communities in all their different expressions?
Well, Parliament has to determine the functionality of that voice mechanism. One of the claims has been there's no detail, but the Langdon report articulated a number of models and a preferred model, but Parliament will make a determination on that. I mean, in broad terms, it's probably going to be 25 to 30 people, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, from remote, regional and urban settings. They'll be elected. Kate, I believe in the ACT there's been a voice for how many years?
It would be pretty close to 10.
Yeah, 10 years. So, it's not a novel proposal. And anyway, for Aboriginal people, we're often very place-based. We have local communities, incredible diversity across the country, and it's an impossible ask to capture all that multiplicity of voices in 20 to 30 people. But there'll be a mechanism yet to be devised that will enable people to vote for representatives. Here in Victoria, we've had the experience now of a second iteration of voting for the Assembly, and we're sort of well down the pathway with the O'Rourke Truth-Telling Commission. We're moving into, a period where there'll be discussion undertaken around treaty. But I think across Victoria, not every Aboriginal person necessarily feels, Koori Victorians and mob from other states, that their voices are totally captured, but I'm sure that you could, make the same observation about Parliament per se. Anyway, this mechanism will be a voice to Parliament. It'll be speaking back to bureaucracy. It won't be part of the bureaucracy. That's one of the ways it's been mischaracterised. It has to be in the Constitution so that it can't be removed at the whim of political parties. And I think over time, as you mentioned, it will evolve and develop and become a wonderful mechanism for Aboriginal people speaking about the important things in our lives across the country.
Peter, while I've got you, just reminded me of another question that was posed to us earlier from the people who registered some questions. There seems to be some very loud Indigenous voices who are in very vehement opposition to the voice, and it's hard for people to understand the context of why people would be so negative about it on one side of politics and the other in different ways. Can you explain that to us a little bit further?
Yeah, so, I'll name them. There's Jacinta Price on the extreme right and Lydia Thorpe on the extreme left, and then in between, moving from pole to pole, is Warren Mundine. I can't really track his sort of line of argument, but unfortunately, over the last 10 months, if you're just a cursory viewer of media or online, you would, if you're a person with little or no interest in Aboriginal affairs, you would come away with the thought that, Aboriginal people don't want voice. Torres Strait Islander people don't want voice, so why would I even consider voting for it? And on the other hand, I know from speaking to lots of allies and supporters, they come to me and they say, oh, what should we do? Should we vote for voice or not? I don't want to do the wrong thing by Aboriginal people. So those two extreme viewpoints that have had extensive media coverage, media loves conflict as we all know, have dominated the landscape, the voice landscape. But if there's one thing you take away from tonight from me, that is that 80% of Aboriginal people have been asking for voice. There's been consistent polling, sometimes up to 90% over the last 2 years. We've been asking for voice for decades. The Uluru Statement of the Heart, 6 years ago now, was a very, very extensive consultation process over 2.5 years with mob all over the country. And Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, we said we didn't just want symbolic recognition. We didn't want a preamble, we didn't want to be just mentioned in the Constitution. We wanted to have a practical way of improving the hopes and aspirations of our peoples.
Thank you, Peter. Bryce, we've seen a lot of misinformation, there's a lot of confusing messaging, there's a lot of assertions that are being made about things that don't seem to actually relate it to the actual referendum, and people bring up a lot of other things or other either fears or grievances that they have when they're talking about the referendum and what the voice might mean for the future. But how is it that we must not lie if we're putting an ad in the paper to sell a jacket or a lawnmower, but you can lie when you're putting with our political statements? I wonder if people are aware of the disconnect between our expectations of truth in some forms of advertising and untruth in other types of advertising.
Yeah, it's a great question, Melissa. I know I've personally been incredibly disheartened to see misinformation and lies take root in our community down here on the peninsula. And so I think this is a very relevant question, not just for the national debate, but I think for our local constituency as well. In commerce, misleading and deceptive conduct is prohibited, you're right. That's under the Australian consumer law. A referendum, much like federal elections, has no such prohibition. Telling a lie about the voice is perfectly legal, I'm sad to say. Some states and a territory have truth in politics laws that do regulate what can be said around state or territory elections. I think it's South Australia and the ACT. There's been discussion at the federal level for bringing this in. It has not been enacted, and it certainly doesn't apply for the referendum at the moment. My recommendation to everyone in the audience is that you really have to sort of look back to those sort of trusted sources. For the referendum itself, it's the AEC. RMIT has an excellent peer-reviewed fact-check body, so does the SBS. So does SBS. I think in the age of social media, though, having accurate information out there isn't necessarily the problem. There's a credibility gap. People don't trust certain sources of information or where they're getting their information from. Where people do trust information or where they trust certain sources is actually friends and family. And so I think probably the most sort of powerful tool you have to confront misinformation in this debate is respectful conversations. Engaging people with evidence, engaging people you know with evidence, respectful, kind, open dialogue is the best way to confront misinformation. Democracy dies in darkness, and I think it's incumbent upon all of us to bring the light.
Well, a lot of people are saying things like it's not safe for democracy and that the referendum will open up a can of worms and do terrible things. What's the legal view of the reliability of the referendum and the voice proposal?
So you're getting to the certainty of the voice?
Yeah, and who should people trust when if you don't know about the law, and it's just the mystery, who do you trust when you're looking at what might happen with the voice and what might not happen with the voice?
Melissa's doing a great job to get a lawyer to say to trust a lawyer, so just... I think the honest answer for that is to look towards aggregators, look towards institutions that have sort of self-reinforcing models of information. So you've got fantastic work being done by the Australian, so the Legal Council of Australia, our universities, Monash, Melbourne, doing some fantastic work putting out information from their law schools about the voice. There's podcasts, there's webinars. I've been to a number of seminars myself, trying to understand sort of what this means. It shouldn't take a lawyer to look at those 95 words and go, well, that's not going to lead to a flood of litigation. It's not going to lead to these levels of uncertainty that our robust 120-year-old democracy cannot withstand. But what we all have to do is make sure we're looking for those. Like it's not just going to happen. You're not just going to suddenly understand your neighbour's not just suddenly going to become a legal professor. I think that those conversations have to draw down those trusted sources, credible sources, and make them relevant to people you're speaking to.
Can I just make a comment? I think it's really important to remember that the words of the constitutional change weren't put together by politicians. So Albo and the cabinet didn't say we're going to write this thing, or whatever. It was put together by a group of very, very eminent constitutional lawyers that are, non-partisan, that really understand the Constitution. So it wasn't put together by a mob of politicians, but that should give you confidence.
And Kate, we were just talking earlier about the fact that so many conservative and conventional political figures and legal figures have assured everyone that it's perfectly safe. You quoted something to me earlier that was just really spot on, and now I've lost what it was, but you'll remember what it was.
I've probably forgotten what it was too. But I think the reality here is that there's been a range of parliamentary inquiries, expert panels, expert groups that have put this together over a period of time, and the sort of people like French and the Solicitor General and Hayden and a range of others, ex-High Court judges. The Solicitor General. These are really conservative lawyers, I can promise. They're, on the whole, it's boring as batshit, but apart from that, they are not people who take risks, I can promise. And they're the ones that put together these words. And I think that's the thing that certainly gives me confidence as a non-lawyer that this isn't scary. And the comment that's often been made by some that this will stop the whole process of government happening, rave. It simply won't, just like my small business ombudsman role didn't stop policy for small business, so on. The reality is, what this will do is give government, when they're looking at Indigenous issues, an entity that is representative to talk to. So from my perspective and my experience, the hard thing about Indigenous policy, and sorry about this, was finding out who to talk to. Because there was lots of different mobs, lots of different families. The clarity wasn't clear, which is the reason Voice was set up in the ACT, really, to bring together the various families, the various mobs in the area, to be the entity that government could consult with. And it's worked really, really well. The other thing I wanted to say is remember that this entity is not a big bureaucracy, and it doesn't it doesn't run programs, it doesn't give out grants, it doesn't do any of the things you'd expect, say, the Department for Indigenous Affairs to do. It is a little entity that gives advice to government on issues that affect Indigenous people based upon what communities are saying. And I think that's pretty important. So it's not like ASIC, it's not like one of those big things with lots of money handing out to all sorts of people. It is really clear what this is.
Yes, it's not the government department that provides the services. It's an advisory body that advises on where those services might best be placed.
That's absolutely right. So it doesn't have huge numbers of people at all. But what it'll do, hopefully, is give the department and the minister good advice on what works and what doesn't work. And I think one of the things to show why, if you ask Indigenous people about what will work in their communities, great example was COVID, during COVID, because, well, don't tell any of you guys about the difficulties that government had running policy during that time. What happened with regard to Indigenous or to Aboriginal health services, government said, you guys, you manage it out in your communities and we'll make sure you're appropriately funded to do it, because they had no other way to do it. And Indigenous people were seen as being seriously at risk because their levels of health status, a whole range of things, are lower than others. You know what happened? 6 times fewer Indigenous people died from COVID than in the rest of the community, because the Aboriginal health services ran it so well when they were actually given the power to do so.
So, Kate, I just want to pick up something that you were speaking about there, because you talked about that it will make government processes more efficient and more correctly applied. A number of people have asked questions about, will there be an additional GST? Will there be an occupation tax on land? Will I have access to the beach? A lot of people are obviously worried about, people are genuinely worried about these things because they've been told that on Facebook, or they've been told that by their uncle or whatever, and I think it's important that we address that.
Look, I absolutely agree, and I think that those of us who can remember when the Mabo decision came down, there was a range of similar comments that happened, because people are worried about that stuff, and I can fully appreciate, particularly with cost of living, all of the issues that are affecting people's lives right now. But I read out what the change is. This is an advisory group that makes representation to government on issues that affect Indigenous people. It has no taxing capacity, it has no veto capacity, it has no capacity to make policy. All of those things live with the Parliament that we elect.
Thank you. Peter, I want to ask you a hard question that was put to us in the pre-questions. So I understand if this is maybe you don't want to answer it, I'll have a go if you can't. But can you talk to us about what it would mean for First Nations people if this referendum fails and we're not successful in coming together at that moment on the 14th of October?
Well, I think it'd be pretty devastating. I don't know, a lot of mob have been, the polls have been going down south for a long time, so on some levels there's some psychological preparation going on. I think we're just asking for the most simple, modest request. Nothing, we're not going to take backyards. We're not going to take pastoral stations. We just want some advice on policies that impact every aspect of our lives. And it's a modest request. It's really hard to, if this doesn't get up, it'll be a missed opportunity for nationhood. I'm really sorry that it's been politicised. It didn't need to be. It could have been handled as an opportunity to create a forward-looking aspirational vision for our country. So many countries around the world have, for a long period of time, had Aboriginal parliamentary representation. I think Māori people, through the Treaty of Waitangi since 1895, have had 7 reserved seats in Parliament. The Scandinavian countries have had, for about the same time as ATSIC was concluded, they've had Sami parliaments in 3 countries. Canada, they look at Australia and they just go, they can't understand that we have, we're the only former British colony without a treaty. We're asking for the gentlest of first steps of voice, an advisory body, from an international perspective, in terms of Australia's relationship with its Indigenous peoples, it'll be shaming, I think, Aboriginal way we say shaming. Only former British colony without a treaty. In 1967, up until that point, the federal government had better intel on the number of sheep in Australia. They didn't know how many first Australians there was. And in 1967, Australia, to their great credit, 92% almost, voted in support of, solving a terrible inequity. That us first Australians weren't counted as people, the longest continuous living culture on earth. We weren't counted as peoples in our own countries. And people saw this as a terrible inequity, and they voted to change that. This is a different argument. This is about exceptionalism. This is about one group in society, First Nations people, having a special element, an advisory body. So the case has to be made, why is that needed? And on any measure, on any indicator, the lives of First Australians are much, much poorer than mainstream. There's now 19 close the gap targets. For 11 years there's been annual reports to federal government. There's some slight improvement, but those 19 targets, most of them, they're tracking, there's been no discernible improvement. $4 billion is spent annually by the federal government on Aboriginal affairs. It's not working. The Productivity Commission in July does a 3-year analysis of expenditure, and they said, in terms of the national agreement signed by Scott Morrison and the premiers, there'd been little or no improvement in pursuing self-determination, in pursuing, supporting on-ground, place-based organisations. So, it'll be extremely disappointing. The older Aboriginal leadership will just walk away. The Noel Pearsons, the Marshall Langdons, the Tom Helmers, they've fought for decades, and they'll say, it's over to you, young mob. And I don't know how young mob's going to respond. They might be more militant. They might, just pursue a treaty first and only. I don't know. But I do know, given the levels of vitriol and racism that have been visited upon our community members, I've got mobs sitting here who know, like you walk down the street, if you're wearing stuff like this, and you get attacked, when we wake up that day after, imagine what it would have been like, after the same-sex plebiscite, if Rainbow Mob woke up and they were told that the love they have for each other is rejected by the rest of Australia. Now, how do you stay in the country? How do you cope with that? Well, if we wake up and it's a resounding no, and it's a double majority no, the majority of Australians don't vote for it, and no jurisdiction does, it's really hard to move beyond that in the short term. I think the trajectory is, that is, we will move to the light, towards the light, as you mentioned, Bryce. But you just don't know with these things. This could be just a once in a lifetime opportunity, and for older people. I think of our young ones. The Aboriginal way, we always think about our young ones. We think about our elders too, but we want our young people to. We don't want them to be imprisoned at rates much, much worse. We want our young mob to finish school. We want our young mob to own their own homes, to enjoy long and healthy lives. We just want what all Australians get.
Thank you. one. One of the things that is confusing people is the suggestion that the referendum is injecting race into the Constitution. It's putting a race-based section into the Constitution. Do you have any reflections? I'm asking a question,
Well,
I should answer myself, but do you have any reflections on where that suggestion is coming from and if it's accurate or not?
Well, the 1967 referendum, which, as you know, gave Indigenous people capacity to vote, but the actual referendum gave the federal government capacity to make laws with regard to Indigenous people. So that's happened back then, and 90% of us voted for that. And so this is just a tiny extra step which creates a voice. So it recognises Indigenous people and creates a voice. So Parliament already has the capacity to make laws with regard to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders. So it's just sort of, it's not right.
And how come that allegations become so volatile?
I was just going to add that our constitution's always been based in race. The original race power was actually put in to keep an eye on the Chinese. That was the original race power that was put in the first draft in 1901. It was what we had to sort of amend because it was then repurposed for Indigenous Australians. So to say that our constitution sort of is race blind is completely inaccurate. What we're attempting to do is to unpick that. We are trying to sort of learn from the last 120 years of history, and as we've grown as a society, try and remediate what was already in the Constitution. So I completely reject any suggestion that by addressing the shortfalls within the Constitution when it comes to race, that we are injecting race into the debate, because what we're doing is the opposite.
Can I just add, I think you all got a copy of your statement at the heart. It's really short, and it talks about walking forward together, and that always brings a tear to my eye a bit, really, because I think that's an incredibly generous statement, taking into account the difficulties that Indigenous people have had since colonisation in Australia. So I think that a yes vote will do the opposite to being race-based. It will hopefully mean we're in a position to walk forward together. And I think that's pretty exciting. 65,000 years, the longest continuous culture. I'm pretty proud of being part of that, even though I'm not. But they've asked us to walk forward together, and I think that's pretty